Je vous invite à vous installer, à prendre place assez rapidement à présent. Si chacun peut s'asseoir assez rapidement. Comme on a déjà un petit peu de retard sur le programme, c'est aussi bien si on peut démarrer rapidement. Please take your seats. The conference is going to be in French and in English, so keep your headset ready. Please go to your seat. Take your place. Bonjour à tous, bienvenue. Waouh, une grande salle. On avait 12 inscrits le 1er février. On a vraiment tous une chance et quelqu'un qu'il faut remercier en premier. Je ne sais pas qui c'est, mais c'est celui qui a décidé qu'il y avait 29 jours au mois de février cette année. Je voudrais donc vous souhaiter à tous la bienvenue, vous dire à tous à quel point on est content que vous êtes là. Je crois qu'il y a plus de 1800 inscrits. Plus de 1800 inscrits qui ont tous été choisis pour leur capacité à changer quelque chose dans le monde du bâtiment. 1800 inscrits qui sont des gens qui ne se contentent pas d'habiter les bâtiments, mais qui sont aussi habités par les bâtiments, que vous êtes. Si vous regardez autour de vous, il n'y a autour de vous que des gens qui sont capables de faire avancer ce sujet. Alors 2 mots de remerciement pour tous les partenaires, évidemment nos partenaires institutionnels, mais aussi nos partenaires associés, qui sont plus d'une quarantaine et qui ont participé à l'élaboration de ce forum et à sa montée en puissance rapide et réactive. Il faut vraiment les remercier pour ça. Il y a eu 20 événements, plus de 20 événements de pré-forum les jours derniers. Et évidemment, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs de l'exposition et les exposants qui aussi se sont mobilisés pour ces 2 jours et pour faire de ces 2 jours une réussite. Donc vraiment, je vous remercie d'être là. Quel chemin parcouru depuis la COP21. Vous avez tous le programme, je ne vais pas revenir dessus, j'étais censé le présenter. On est un peu en retard, je pense que je vais entrer directement dans le vif du sujet. Cette séquence a pour objet de poser le décor, de nous dire pourquoi nous sommes tous réunis ici et qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire collectivement de cet événement. Pour ça, je vais demander à Madame Natalia Alonso-Cano de me rejoindre sur scène, du Bureau des Nations Unies pour la réduction des risques de catastrophe. Je crois que c'est par là, je ne me souviens pas. Je vais demander à Jamie Ferguson, de la Société financière internationale du groupe Banque mondiale, de me rejoindre aussi. Et à Roland Roche, de l'Agence internationale des énergies renouvelables. Veuillez prendre place. Profitez de ce moment pour regarder derrière vous ou autour de vous. OK ? Alors, On a un partenaire essentiel pour l'organisation de ce forum, c'est le Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, le Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement avec lequel nous sommes partenaires depuis la COP 21 et la création de la Global ABC. Il y a une personne qui dirigeait le bureau de Paris de la Global ABC, et je me souviens encore du jour où on est allé lui proposer de créer la Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. C'était en 2015. Je crois que c'était 3 mois avant la COP. Personne ne nous a cru à ce moment-là. Et Ligia Noronia était là, il nous a dit allons-y. Donc je vous invite à accueillir Ligia Noronia du Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement qui va nous dire quelques mots d'introduction au nom de Inger Andersen. Ligia, si vous voulez aller au podium.
Good morning. I'm going to speak in English. My French is really poor, but you all have your translation, so it should be fine. Excellencies, I'm here for this morning. I'm representing Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environmental Programme. But I also want to say how very happy I am personally to be here, because as Yves mentioned, I've been involved with this ever since 2015, and so it gives me great pleasure to see how big this has grown over the years. But now let me read the speech on behalf of my Executive Director. Excellencies, my thanks to Minister Christophe Béchu, Minister of Ecological Transition and Territorial Cohesion, and to the Government of France for showing strong leadership on decarbonizing the buildings and construction sector. UNEP greatly appreciates France's partnership in the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and the Buildings Breakthrough, launched at COP28. The first Buildings and Climate Global Forum is an important next step in this agenda. We need to provide a built environment that works for everyone to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, but it cannot come at the expense of further climate disruption. The first global stocktake found that the world is off track on the targets of the Paris Agreement. UNEP's emission gap report found that we need to shave 28% of emissions by 2030 for 2 degrees centigrade and 42% for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Slow progress in decarbonizing the buildings and construction sector is part of the reason we are so far behind. Some 21% of greenhouse gas emissions are linked to this sector. We must act, and we have a chance to act. Half of the buildings that will exist by 2050 are not built. Another 20% of the building stock needs to be renovated by 2030 to make it zero carbon ready. There are many elements, Excellencies, to this transition. My colleagues from UN Habitat, the International Energy Agency, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and IRENA are today covering aspects such as adequate housing, energy decarbonization and efficiency, and climate resilience. I will focus on the need for a life cycle approach to reduce embodied carbon from building materials. There's good reason for this focus. In fast developing economies, construction materials will dominate resource consumption. Associated emissions are expected to double by 2060. However, we can adopt 3 key strategies to avoid these emissions. 1, introduce circularity into the economy, thus aiming to reduce, or in some cases even avoid, extraction and production of new raw materials. This means better design and reuse and recycling of materials. It also means renovation of old buildings, which create 75% less emissions than new construction. These elements will obviously require strong policy support. 2, shift to ethically produced bio-based building materials. Using materials like timber, bamboo, and biomass could shave 40% off 2050 emissions in some places. So it makes sense to increase the market share of such low-carbon materials and increase finance in research and development. 3, improve building materials and processes. Embodied emissions from cement, iron, and steel are significant, but they can be reduced or eliminated by changing formulas and processes. Green procurement protocols and policies can help incentivize industry to make these changes. Excellencies, friends, Deploying these strategies would make a huge difference, not just to climate change, but some 17% of all plastics are used for buildings and construction. Those who work in these buildings inhale plastic dust from carpets, false ceilings, and other plastic materials. So finding safe alternatives as well as efficiencies could, if done right, contribute to both increasing workers' health and a reduction in CO2 emissions, as well as support the long-term success of the instrument to end plastic pollution currently under negotiation. And of course, support other international agreements, including the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. As we start a cycle of submitting new nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, countries have a chance to integrate these strategies into their plans. But international cooperation and multi-level governance will be crucial to accelerate action. I am pleased that boosting such cooperation is the aim of this forum, which includes a local government roundtable. Those discussions will build on the outcomes of the Cities and Regions Summit, which took place on the sidelines of the 6th session of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, held last week in Nairobi. My thanks again to France for its great leadership on buildings and construction. Transitioning to low-carbon, climate-resilient buildings will create jobs, improve lives, and help to slow the triple planetary crisis: the crisis of climate change, the crisis of nature and land loss, and the crisis of pollution and waste. This forum is therefore doing incredibly important work. I look forward to hearing how you can increase international cooperation and multi-level governance for decarbonized buildings and construction sector. Thank you.
Merci, merci Ligia. À la COP 27, Christophe Béchu a annoncé la tenue de ce forum. Il y a une personne qui a rendu ce forum possible depuis l'origine. Il y a une personne qui l'a soutenu depuis l'origine. Il y a une personne qui nous accueille tous ici aujourd'hui. C'est Christophe Béchu, le ministre de la Transition écologique et de la cohésion des territoires. Je souhaite l'appeler au podium pour qu'il nous délivre quelques mots. Merci, Monsieur le ministre, si vous pouvez.
Madame la sous-secrétaire générale, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames et Messieurs les parlementaires, je salue les élus, les patrons d'organisations. Je vous salue chacune et chacun en vos titres, vos grades ou vos qualités. C'est la toute première fois, aussi surprenant que ça puisse paraître, que se réunissent des ministres, des acteurs clés du secteur du bâtiment, des organisations professionnelles pour discuter de ce sujet. Ce qui peut sembler totalement inconcevable puisque ce dont nous parlons, la façon dont on construit, la façon dont on habite cette planète, c'est 7% des emplois de la planète, c'est 13% du PIB mondial et c'est 50% de la valeur, de la richesse entre guillemets, consolidée de nos États ou de la totalité des acteurs. Pendant longtemps, l'acte de construire, c'était l'acte d'habiter quelque part. Et donc, la façon dont les choses se passaient en Suisse, au Bangladesh, au Brésil, en Angola, n'avait pas un impact sur ce qui se passait dans le pays d'à côté. La course dans laquelle nous sommes entrés, de lutte contre le dérèglement climatique, le poids des émissions de gaz à effet de serre liées à la fois à la construction et à la vie des bâtiments une fois que ces bâtiments sont construits. On parle de chiffres qui varient selon qu'on compare les émissions énergétiques, c'est 1/3 des émissions énergétiques de la planète, aux émissions qui sont plus largement liées ensuite à des cycles de vie, à des chiffres qui sont supérieurs à 20%. Bref, on est obligé de se demander si dans la façon dont on construit, dans la façon dont on habite, on permet d'être aligné avec les engagements pris à l'accord de Paris au moment de la COP également 15 de Kunming-Montréal sur la préservation de la biodiversité, sur la limitation d'une forme d'étalement urbain dont nous connaissons les conséquences. Ce temps à Paris, il est précisément conçu pour qu'on prenne ce temps, à 1800, à partir d'une initiative et d'une intuition qui, effectivement, a été prise par la France et le Maroc, que je veux saluer, avec le soutien immédiat de 28 gouvernements, dont beaucoup sont là ce matin, avec le lancement, pendant la COP27, de ce building Becktrav, dont nous avons aujourd'hui cette manifestation. Et pour une raison très simple. Le problème n'est pas derrière nous. L'accentuation aujourd'hui des conséquences du dérèglement climatique, chacun la constate. Mais l'acte de construire n'est pas derrière nous. La moitié des bâtiments qui existeront dans le monde en 2060 ne sont pas construits. Tous les 5 jours, il se construit dans le monde l'équivalent de la ville de Paris. Et chaque année, c'est plus que la surface totale de tous les bâtiments du Japon qui s'ajoutent au patrimoine immobilier mondial. La façon dont nous allons construire ces espaces va impacter, bien sûr, les modes de vie de nos concitoyens, mais notre rapport à la nature, la solidité des engagements internationaux que nous avons été capables de prendre. Et on n'est pas ici pour faire un constat, pour constater la montée de l'acidification des océans, les difficultés que nous avons par rapport aux espèces. On est ici pour travailler, pour trouver des solutions. Et on ne le fait pas contre politique avec l'obsession d'une déclaration, on le fait avec l'ensemble des professionnels pour montrer qu'il y a d'ores et déjà des solutions qui existent. L'enjeu, c'est que nous nous séparions avec la déclaration de Chaillot, qui est le nom de notre cité de l'architecture et du patrimoine, où vous aurez l'occasion de passer un moment pendant ce forum, pour rappeler ce que sont nos principes, pour décliner ce que sont nos engagements et pour renforcer notre coopération internationale sur ces différents sujets. L'enjeu, c'est qu'avec vous tous et vous toutes, maires, ingénieurs, urbanistes, bureaux d'études, gouverneurs, ministres, entreprises de construction, on puisse montrer que l'usage des matériaux biosourcés, l'appui des énergies renouvelables, la façon d'aller penser de manière différente l'occupation de l'espace existe, qu'il y a des quantités d'endroits sur la planète où nous pouvons nous inspirer de ce qui fonctionne et que cet échange de bonnes pratiques, il sera bon pour la manière dont nos concitoyens vivront et il nous permettra de préserver la durabilité et les ressources de notre planète. On s'efforce en France en interdisant les passoires énergétiques, en imposant des analyses de cycle de vie, en prenant des lois pour limiter l'étalement urbain, de pousser et d'avancer. Mais je crois au benchmark, je crois au partage des initiatives, je crois à la comparaison de la façon dont les autres ont été capables de trouver des solutions à des problèmes que nous rencontrons nous-mêmes. Et je crois qu'il y a un certain nombre de solutions françaises qui peuvent aussi inspirer d'autres territoires. Je ne serai pas beaucoup plus long parce que l'enjeu, je le redis, ce n'est pas une succession de prises de parole politiques, c'est la multiplication des angles et des focales qui vont nous permettre d'avancer. Je vous livre seulement cette anecdote pour terminer. En 1924, se tenaient des Jeux Olympiques à Paris. Et pour la première fois dans l'histoire des Jeux Olympiques, le village des athlètes, qui était installé à Colombes, était électrifié. Jamais, avant 1924, les athlètes n'avaient pu bénéficier d'un village avec de l'électricité. Et il ne vous a pas échappé que dans la foulée de 1924, l'électrification est devenue la norme partout. En 2024, des Jeux Olympiques se tiennent à Paris. Je vous rassure, le village est bien sûr électrifié. Mais pour la première fois dans l'histoire des Jeux Olympiques, il est 100% alimenté par des énergies renouvelables. Et les bâtiments sont biosourcés, sont résilients. Les trottoirs qui sont dans ce village ont été conçus pour laisser passer l'eau et pour pouvoir continuer à remplir les nappes phréatiques. la biodiversité a été intégrée à chacune des espaces. Bref, ce village est en quelque sorte un démonstrateur de la ville durable. Je forme le souhait que de la même manière que l'électrification a pu profiter, entre guillemets, de cette exposition médiatique du village d'athlètes de Colombes en 1924, ce village d'athlètes de 2024, biosourcé, résilient, s'inscrivant dans finalement ce que nous essayons de faire et de poser, puisse lui aussi devenir une forme d'inspiration. Un immense merci d'être là, un immense merci du temps que vous allez passer, un immense merci de montrer dans ces moments géopolitiques compliqués que nous vivons qu'il y a des sujets qui sont capables de nous transcender, de nous réunir et qui valent le coup, qu'on se parle, qu'on se traduise et qu'on fasse en sorte de passer du temps à construire ensemble. Un immense merci et très bon forum à nous tous.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, pour ces propos inspirants, pour votre soutien. J'en profite pour dire que demain à 13h, dans cette même salle, il y aura la présentation du village olympique par Nicolas Ferrand, qui en a dirigé les travaux. Une présentation plus technique, si ça vous intéresse. C'est l'heure du déjeuner, mais je pense que ça vaut le coup de venir. Alors, chaque année, depuis 2016 ou 2017, l'Alliance mondiale pour le bâtiment Global ABC produit un Global Status Report, un rapport sur l'état de l'art, disons, en matière d'immobilier, de bâtiment et de climat. Oliver Rapp, qui en est depuis quelques années le principal rédacteur, donc je lui demande de venir nous présenter, afin de poser le décor, les résultats du rapport de cette année. Oliver, c'est à vous.
Thank you very much. Minister Béju, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure to present the 8th edition of the Global Status Report on Buildings and Construction, which the UN Environment Programme and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction are releasing today. The Buildings GSR, as we call it, is an annual snapshot and has become a global reference document, and it describes the pathway of the buildings and construction sector towards Paris. It provides data on CO2 emissions, on energy emissions. It provides information about policy progress, and it summarizes all the findings in a global buildings climate tracker. The report is a truly collaborative effort, and it's led by a team from UCL under the leadership of Professor Ian Hamilton, colleagues from my own team at BPIE, significant contributions from the IEA, and many other members of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. If we look at the conclusion of this year's report, we have to say that due to the globally growing emissions from buildings and construction, and due to slowing investments and slowing policy efforts, the sector is unfortunately not on track. That's a bold statement, and I think it requires that we provide some evidence for this statement. And the question is, how can we best provide that? The answer which we are developing and which we are presenting is in the form of a global tracker. We asked the question, where do we want the sector to go? We want to be at a zero carbon situation in 2050, and we've defined an artificial goal with that index that we want to have 100 decarbonization points achieved. This pathway which you see here is aligned to the IEA net zero emissions pathway. So that's the goal. If we then look at how far we have come since we started to measure in 2015, which is defined by this dark blue line at the bottom, you see that we have not come very far. We are far off track from this ideal decarbonization pathway where we should be, and currently the gap amounts to almost 40 decarbonization points. In fact, we see a stagnation since 2015, and this lack of progress is caused by a significant gap in the progress of the indicators which make up this index. And I want to talk about some of these indicators now. If we're looking at the CO2 emissions from the sector, we see that we now have again reached a peak. Compared to the year before, emissions have grown by 1%, and these are the emissions which are associated with the operations, the use of buildings. There was a peak in 2018, there was then a bit of a decline, mainly caused by the global COVID pandemic, but we're now again going in the wrong direction, emissions are growing. If we add then the emissions from construction materials, from the products of, which are used in construction and in buildings, we find that over 1/3 of global emissions are caused by the sector. So the big question is, of course, how on earth can we get back on track? And what we are illustrating here is a pathway how we could get back on track so that we're back on track by 2030 and that we are then following the pathway. But that getting back on track would mean that we achieve 10 decarbonisation points between now and 2030, which simply means we need to accelerate the action significantly. So let's look at some of the other indicators which could positively contribute to that acceleration. One of the solution levers we have is, of course, energy efficiency. And so we're asking the question, how much is being globally invested in energy efficiency in the buildings and construction sector? The data which you see here shows a positive trend. The bars are going up. The last bar on the very right shows an estimate for 2023. We don't have the final figures yet, but all in all, it looks promising. We expect a bit of a decline in 2023 due to the global interest rate situation and some economic stability, but all in all, the trend seems to be positive. However, if we look at the regional details where this trend has been positively influenced, we see that the significant growth in 22 is mainly caused in the European Union, because the EU took a political decision to invest much of its recovery and resilience funding, which it allocated due to the COVID pandemic, into energy efficiency in the sector. If you look at the other regions, we don't see a significant growth as we see in the European Union. So what's the impact of these investments? Well, normally we would expect that the energy intensity, the kilowatt hours per square meter, is going down, and we're seeing that, in fact, as you can see in the dark blue line. However, again, it's not going down fast enough, which in turn means that we need to really accelerate the investments, that we need to introduce policies such as the EU has just done, minimum energy performance standards, for example, for existing buildings, but also that we need to introduce national renovation roadmaps and really tackle the issue of having more effective policies for the renovation, for the increase of energy efficiency in the sector. The other solution lever we, of course, have is renewables. The share of renewables in the final energy consumption, both for heating and cooling and electrification, should of course grow significantly. Again, we have an ideal pathway to the decarbonisation goal, and we are observing that since we measure the situation, the share of renewable energy in final energy consumption in buildings and construction has hardly changed. From 5% back in 2015, now to 5.9%, while we actually should be at over 11%, to also meet that interim target, that interim milestone of over 18% in 2030. So what that requires, essentially, is that we have a significant growth per year. It requires that we have policies in place which overall phase out fossil fuels in heating and cooling, increase the share of renewable energy in heating and cooling, and again, make sure that the building stock is actually ready to take up, to absorb these technologies for renewable heating and cooling. Now, many of these solutions can be steered, of course, via building codes. And the report also looks at the question, how many building codes do we have in countries around this world? What you see on the map are different color codes. The darkest colors are countries which have a mandatory building code. The lighter blue colors are the countries which have a voluntary building code, and the red colors are countries which have no building code at the moment. You see the red being concentrated in Africa and in South America, Latin America, and that of course is a big concern because we all know that these are the geographical regions where we are expecting enormous growth in built-up surface. If We then ask the question, well, are these codes actually aligned with achieving a carbon neutral, a climate neutral building stock by 2050? Are these codes supporting zero emission buildings? Then we have to say, well, at the moment, globally, we find only 3. And those 3 literally have been put in place since the last 2 years, so we don't know much about their effect at this point in time. And so clearly, the building code development and implementation, the effective implementation, has to be ramped up significantly. Now, I've talked a lot about mitigation opportunities in the sector. We all know that our buildings are increasingly exposed to the effects of climate change, an increase of extreme weather events, floods, storms, hurricanes, and the like. There is therefore also a significant need to invest into adaptation in the building stock, for the existing building stock, and to have adaptation solutions in new buildings. And there is a significant opportunity to link the codes which are improving energy efficiency, which are introducing renewables, with technologies to support adaptation. So in the end, what we need is a combined code for mitigation and adaptation for our buildings. We currently do not have much quantitative analysis on that, simply because there is not much data available, which would allow us to do that, but this is a strong political message coming out of this report as well. So I know the status quo is sobering, and the situation is, I think, a wake-up call. But if we look at the trend lines of the indicators which I've shown you, they're all going in the right direction. They're just not going in the right direction fast enough. And I think the evidence which we have that there are political successes, that strong policy signals can change the market, and that we can learn from these positive examples, help us to roll up our sleeves and take the necessary policy and business decisions to really put the sector back on track to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci Oliver. Il y a au moins un indicateur qui n'est pas tracé par le Global Status Report, c'est l'indicateur de la mobilisation du milieu professionnel et des gouvernements. Et je pense que là, cet indicateur, il faudrait le tracer parce qu'il est en très forte progression. Témoin ce qui se passe aujourd'hui et témoin ce qui s'est passé à la COP aussi 28, où on a vraiment senti que les gens commencent à prendre ce sujet en charge d'une manière extrêmement visible à présent. Et je crois que ça, c'est un indicateur important justement de la réaction. Alors pour réagir à ces quelques propos, on a réuni nos partenaires, qui sont des partenaires principaux qui ont voulu s'engager dans l'organisation de ce forum. Je vais peut-être commencer par vous, Jamie. Donc vous êtes le représentant de l'AFC, de la World Bank. Vous êtes responsable des investissements climat, plutôt dans le domaine privé. Vous êtes orienté vers les marchés émergents, ce qui, comme l'a démontré Oliver et comme le démontrent les études, sont les marchés clés. Pourquoi ? Parce que les bâtiments, quand ils sont construits, non seulement ils ont leur propre bilan carbone de construction, mais aussi, d'une certaine manière, ils entraînent le bilan carbone de leur vie entière. J'ai entendu quelqu'un dire que nous construisions actuellement beaucoup de bâtiments à rénover, prêts à rénover d'une certaine manière. C'est-à-dire que dans beaucoup de pays, on continue de construire des bâtiments dont on sait qu'il faudrait qu'ils soient rénovés très rapidement. Donc Jamie, au nom de votre institution, la question que j'ai envie de vous poser, c'est quelle réaction par rapport à ce Global Status Report? Qu'est-ce que vous attendez surtout de ce forum? Et quel rôle votre institution pourra jouer dans la mise en œuvre de ces conclusions?
Merci, Yvelon, and congratulations to the French government and UNEP for bringing us all together for the first time. And thank you for including us as the World Bank Group, much appreciated. So my hope out of these 2 days is for the outcomes that come, not just for collective declaration, but the action that comes after that at the national level. And that's tangible policy reform. And I'm deeply sympathetic to the ministers here, because not only is it hard to gather us collectively at a global level, it's hard to convene this at a national level, because typically control and influence over the building sector is spread across many ministries and regulatory bodies. So it's not easy to solve. And it's in the building codes, as just described, but it's also in incentives. And I think we've seen huge impact of getting the incentives right on this in this space. Those incentives can be both fiscal. So in Colombia, the green building materials have a VAT exemption. In Egypt, public spend has been committed to green buildings with 55,000 affordable green buildings. It can also be non-fiscal, and there's so much emotive human elements to buildings. So it's important to think of those incentives. In Peru, the allowance for an extra floor if you're building green has been incredibly impactful on behavior. In Argentina, faster permitting if you're building green has been incredibly impactful on behavior. So getting those incentives right quickly, because as you say, Yves Laurent, the stuff we do now is going to have a 50-year impact, and so we've got to get it going quickly and get it right. My key hope here, and it was well said in the stock take and well said by colleagues, but it's very easy to get stuck on the first bit of green buildings, which is the energy efficiency at the operational level. But we've got to keep a focus on the supply chain. If we're going to decarbonize steel, if we're going to decarbonize cement, if we're going to decarbonize steel, it's through the nexus where they all come together in buildings. And resilience. I think we're sort of 20 years behind on resilience, and it's got to be at the core of this. We're seeing the impacts globally, and we've got to be building in resilience. So as the voice of emerging markets at the World Bank Group, I would ask all of you and all of us over the next 2 days to keep 5 things in mind for considering the realities in emerging markets, where we heard that half the buildings of 2060 aren't built yet. Well, 80% of those will be built in emerging markets. So if we're not thinking about the realities there, we're not going to sort of change the arc here of growth. Number 1, the need is affordable, resilient green housing. It's affordable housing. That's where it's all going to happen. Number 2, the nature of this build is, and the reality of this build is, it's not centrally done by developers. It's self-build. So we've got to influence how individual homeowners and contractors are building their homes. Number 3 is, and we saw it on the map beautifully, often the reality starts with no building code at all, or even if it exists, it's not enforced. So we've got to find other ways to move the market. We need help. We need help to move these markets. Not all countries can afford the Inflation Reduction Act or Europe's big commitments. So we need ODA, we need philanthropic support to build capacity and to concessional capital to trigger influence markets, cheaper green mortgages to move markets. And then, again, resilience. I'm just back from Mozambique and Bangladesh, and if there were ever places that need resilience in their building stock, those are them. So we as the World Bank Group, and I'm sure I can say on behalf of the other MDBs in the multilateral development banks in the room, we stand ready to support. My colleagues in the IBRD and IDA are there for public policy support and public spend. IFC, we bring a very holistic toolkit to this. We've committed over $11 billion in the last 7 years to green buildings. That's everything from warehousing to affordable housing. Thought leadership, I'll wave it here, but I can give you a QR code. We just released this report on describing the 1.5 trillion investment opportunity in emerging markets. For those of you in the business here, it is an opportunity as well as a challenge. And standard setting. Our EDGE Green Building Code is now used across 100 countries, and our Building Resilience Index supports that on the resilience side, and we're really keen to see the uptake on that. So thank you, Yves Laurent. We have a big team here. We are ready to engage and support all of the signatories to the declaration.
Merci Jamie pour ces propos. Il y a certainement un indicateur qu'on devrait tracer, c'est la proportion d'investissement dans les bâtiments climat compatibles, disons autant en termes d'atténuation qu'en termes d'adaptation, par rapport à la proportion actuelle d'investissement dans des bâtiments qui ne le sont pas. Et en fait, la proportion pour le moment est très petite. Et je pense que l'indicateur principal de notre action commune devrait être celui-là. Comment on arrive finalement à phase out les brown buildings et comment est-ce qu'on arrive sur le long terme à ce résultat. C'est vraiment notre question principale. Alors, vous avez parlé, Jamie, de résilience. On a la chance d'avoir ici l'Agence des Nations Unies qui s'occupe de la question des risques. Donc Natalia, je voudrais vous poser la même question, en fait, hein, la question que j'ai posée à Jamie, et qui est de savoir qu'est-ce que vous entendez de ce Global Stage Report, qu'est-ce que vous en tirez, qu'est-ce que vous attendez de ce forum. La parole est à vous.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Excellencies, distinguished guests, and I'm delighted to be here addressing you as the first forum on buildings and climate. Thank you very much for the initiative, for the efforts put forward by the French government and also by our sister agency, UNEP, and especially to the minister, because I've seen that the leadership that he has played is really important. We all know that in face of escalating climate change's impacts, these type of platforms are actually essential to exchange ideas, to collaborate, to really move forward the transformation that we need and the transformation that has been said that we need, and at the fast pace that we need as well. So in that discussion, besides mitigation, I would like to emphasize the word that has been mentioned a couple of times, resilience. Resilience and sustainability in our infrastructure systems. So as UNDR, as the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we have an unwavering commitment to foster innovative solutions which are needed, to support collaborative efforts in tackling climate change challenges, but especially on the focus on resilience. And what we expect from the forum is really to catalyze these discussions, to exchange, but not only to leave it there, is to really have actionable outcomes that will come out of that. So when we leave from here, we'll have a number of initiatives happening on the ground. And just a couple of points on how to do that, how to make these collaborations, these exchanges fruitful. How we can transform the buildings and construction sector to mitigate and adapt to impacts of climate change. I would say 2 words. Think resilience. It's imperative that we recognize the importance of this thinking resilience approach in the sector. In every time that we think of any investment coming forward in the planning. And that would need to happen at all levels of the government, from local authorities, national authorities, policy frameworks, the private sector. A sustainable future for generations is only possible if we ensure that our infrastructure systems are resilient. Resilience to what? To the systemic, cascading, and compound risks, which are caused by climate change, but also by other man-made hazards. The sector is responsible for a staggering 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and as such, we need to address that. It's a challenge, but also an opportunity. How and why thinking resilience will yield benefits? Because we know that if infrastructure is not built to be climate and disaster resilient, countries will lose the investments they have done in the construction. And at worst, it will put lives of people and livelihoods in danger. some of the data that we have already, and it's according to the Coalition of Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, disasters are expected to cause 732 billion of damages per year to infrastructure assets unless there is an additional resilience measures taken up. So it's a huge cost. And according to the World Bank, the net benefit of building more resilience infrastructure is 1 to 4. So for $1 additional invested in doing a proper resilience infrastructure, we'll be saving 4 in avoided damages. And in the monitoring system of the Sendai framework, we know that around 140,000 infrastructure units are destroyed or damaged every year. And the majority of them, about 40%, are affecting least developed countries and small islands, development states. And it's not only that, it's not only the construction sector, it's also affecting the insurance sector, because the increase of frequency and severity of extreme weather events that have been mentioned are making that the insurers are pulling out of risky areas. So actually, parts of the world are becoming uninsurable. And that means that we need to urgently focus on prevention, adaptation, and resilience measures. So the reality that we have in front of us is that we have all the financial justification to make risk-informed investments. But the reality is that countries are not prioritizing this infrastructure resilience, as it was called by the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So how resilience happens? It doesn't happen because we agree we all should be doing that. Is that we need to put that in practice through the codes that has been mentioning. And in fact, the midterm review of the Sendai Framework last year, in 2023, clear calls to strengthen that aspect on 2 points. The first one is that all infrastructure plans need to be aligned to disaster risk reduction strategies. So the implementation of that plan has to be supported by legal and regulations frameworks that provide responsibilities and accountabilities. And the second point is that multi-hazard disaster risk assessments might be a prerequisite for infrastructure investments. We need to stress test our critical infrastructure systems to go on. Just finally, to end, how is UNDR supporting countries for building this infrastructure resilience? So we are supporting countries globally. How do we do that? We support through conducting infrastructure resilience reviews. So we use a methodology that has been developed by UNDR together with this coalition I was referring to, with CADRI, and builds on the principles for resilient infrastructures that were consulted and agreed by more than 100 member states. This process helps governments and stakeholders to do a number of things. We identify the vulnerabilities, also prioritize what are the improvements that are necessary, and also to understand better the interdependencies between infrastructures and economy. So finally, just to address all of you as we start these discussions today, to really reinforce this international cooperation is absolutely a must to fast track all our efforts, and we need to do it together, jointly. And I would like to recall a UN resolution that it was spearheaded by Poland last year that was really pushing forward towards a global resilience and fostering sustainable development and on infrastructure connectivity. With that push, I would like to just say thank you very much for being here, for dedicating the energy and your thoughts into that, and also think through how these conversations today are going to be contributing to a number of important events happening this year. So we have the Summit of the Future. In September, we have the COP29. And then next year, we'll have the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. So I hope these deliberations and exchanges and concrete outcomes will inform all these processes. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Voilà, les enjeux sont posés hein, en termes de chiffres, disons. Là, en tout cas, nous, à Global ABC, on souhaite que travailler plus avec UNDRR et on est très ravis que vous soyez là. Money, resilience, maintenant énergie. Avec notre ami de l'IRENA, Roland, quel est, en fait, du point de vue de l'Agence internationale des énergies renouvelables, quelle est aussi votre réaction à ce Global Status Report et qu'attendez-vous donc de ce forum en termes de résultats? Et comment pourrez-vous contribuer à la mise en œuvre de ces produits de sortie?
Yeah, thank you very much, Yves Laurent. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it was a great pleasure here to listen to Minister Béchu and Oliver Rapf on this report and the achievements of this conference that is we are just participating. IRENA congratulates the Global Alliance for Building and Construction for the report. The report contains authoritative insights on the decarbonization of the building sector, which is key. Also, we want to congratulate the French government to bring this conference together, which I think is extremely important. As the minister said, we have the problems in the building sector to decarbonize the building sector still in front of us. A lot needs to happen here. We are in the home of the Paris Agreement, and its goal remain within our reach, but we are risking some slipping between our fingers with inaction. So this is really a situation that we see in all sectors, that the technology to decarbonize the sectors...
Hold on, can you just a second, can you switch off your headset? I think it's creating an echo.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
This is in fact what we see in all sectors. The technologies are in place to decarbonize these sectors, but it is just that the speed in decarbonizing these sectors is not fast enough. So especially now till 2030, a lot needs to happen because the steepest decline of the CO2 emissions needs to happen till 2030 to make sure we reach our objectives by 2050. And it is very clear in the building sector, the technologies are available for the constructions of buildings, as we have seen from the results of the report, but also in the operation of the buildings. It's just that we have to speed up and to encourage ourselves to do the necessary investments to achieve these decarbonizations. The building sector, and it has also been said several times, is contributing still 30% of the global CO2 emissions. So we need to act decisively to decarbonize the building sector. This can be achieved with a mixture of energy efficiency and also direct electrification from increasingly renewable power mix globally. IRENA, as the International Renewable Energy Agency with the 169 member countries, we work together with our member countries to accelerate the use of renewable energies and do a better integration also of the renewable energy generation sector with the end-use sectors and the so-called hard-to-decarbonize sector, which the building sector is clearly one of these sectors. IRENA therefore places great hopes in the outcomes of these negotiations at these forums, which, as I said, is an extremely important conference. Not much has happened in the building sector, and to bring all actors and stakeholders of the building sector together is really a great thing. And thanks again here to the French government for doing this. Every moment lost in action increases the challenge we face, especially in the building the rate of energy efficient retrofits needs to grow rapidly to unlock some of the cheapest decarbonization options. we also need to see buildings become more active participants in the energy system. So this is a thing IRENA is actively working on in trying to better integrate the renewable energy generation with the end-use sectors, and to make sure the building sector with the technologies are available, from heat pumps to stationary batteries, to the integration with the electromobility and electro vehicles, but also with stationary batteries, and behind the metering and all aspects that come from digitalization with demand response systems have to be integrated and need to be an integral part of the energy system, because a better integration of the building sector in the entire energy system helps to, let's say, the energy system and the power generation part of the system to decarbonize the building sector, but also vice versa. The building blocks are going to stabilize the operations of a grid, which is still a big challenge, no? And we see it now with the tripling of renewable energy generation goal, which has been taken forwards by the G20 countries, but also at COP28, the infrastructure is lagging behind. And let's say a smart integration in ramping up the renewable energy technologies while the infrastructure is lagging behind is coming from smart electrification, where the buildings are an important part of. And I'm confident that this report and the discussion today will come up with good results that bring further steps towards the actions we need to take to decarbonize the building sector and to decarbonize all sectors, as I've explained, as this integration is extremely important. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Bon, je crois qu'on a entendu beaucoup de choses, hein, énergie, matériaux, logement, financement, toutes ces choses sur lesquelles vous allez travailler toute la journée. Toutes ces choses, il y a un certain nombre de gens ont été choisis pour être sur scène aujourd'hui, mais beaucoup des gens qui ont les solutions à ces questions sont dans la salle et vont se mettre à travailler à partir de maintenant dans les 22 ateliers d'aujourd'hui, 22 ateliers qui vont se tenir sur tous ces sujets qui ont été évoqués maintenant. Je voudrais passer peut-être pour un mot de conclusion la parole à Monsieur le ministre Christophe Béchu pour nous donner l'énergie du travail.
Je ne pense pas que qui que ce soit ait besoin d'une énergie particulière. Vous êtes là, les choses sérieuses sont sur le point de commencer, les enjeux viennent d'être posés, ils sont multiples, parce qu'il y a effectivement cette perspective de l'adaptation, parce qu'il y a la nécessité d'agir tous azimuts. Je repose juste le cadre. L'idée, c'est de se séparer en ayant, pour la première fois, aux côtés d'engagements qui sont pris par les États, État par État, qu'un secteur qui pèse plus de 20% des émissions regarde comment avancer ensemble et se mobiliser pour partager ses solutions et pour partager ses bonnes pratiques. Avec un livrable de fin, la mise en place d'un conseil intergouvernemental qui nous permette d'avancer sur ces sujets dans la continuité de la déclaration de Chaillot, et la perspective ensuite qu'un moment comme celui-là devienne régulier. Il n'y a qu'une condition, c'est qu'entre maintenant et demain, on montre que les intuitions et les promesses qui nous ont conduits à nous retrouver à Paris sont justes, que cette envie de travailler ensemble qui est manifeste dans votre présence et dans votre concentration sur l'ensemble de ces sujets, et se retrouve dans l'efficacité des moments qui commencent maintenant. Donc, let's go to work.
Merci le ministre. Merci Monsieur le ministre. Donc je vous invite tous à rejoindre les ateliers de travail. Je crois que la route est claire. Les engagements sont ceux de chacun, pas seulement ceux des gouvernements, mais ceux des financiers, ceux de tous les acteurs, ceux des architectes, ceux des promoteurs, ceux des fournisseurs de matériaux, ceux des industriels. Et je crois que tout le monde est là pour y répondre. Merci à tous.